Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I just want to repeat the thanks to the organizers, Anne Klein and Learned Foot. Thanks for having me. And it's been wonderful, to learn a lot, from some of my teachers I've had in the past and colleagues and friends. And this paper draws some from Shantideva. I've been thinking a lot about Shantideva, like for the last 7 or 8 years, and trying to put Shantideva in conversation, and particularly Prāsaṅgika Vidyamaka in conversation with Dzogchen. So the title of my paper is The Immanent and Transcendent Ground of Ethics in Prāsaṅgika and the Great Perfection. Prāsaṅgika Vidyamaka is commonly held to be the highest interpretation of Vidyamaka by many Buddhist traditions in Tibet. Prāsaṅgika is a philosophy that draws upon Chandakirti's 7th century interpretation of Nagarjuna and gets its name from a distinctive reductio style of argument, of prasanga, when articulating the nature of emptiness. Prāsaṅgika contrasts with Swatantrika Vidyamaka, a system of thought that makes arguments to prove emptiness, and defends probative arguments about the nature of this truth. Prāsaṅgika is different and exemplifies the radical nature of emptiness in a performative way that collapses the duality of two truths. The 8th century Indian monk, Shantideva, comes to be associated with a Prāsaṅgika Vidyamaka interpretation in Tibet, where the ethical foundation he articulates in the Bodhicharya Avatara is seen to align with Chandakirti's philosophy of emptiness in the Vidyamaka Avatara. Prāsaṅgika's defining mode of characterizing the truth of emptiness is a denial of transcendent foundations to ground truth claims. There's no appeal to irreducible elements or dharmas of dependent arising, nor ineffable particulars, swalakshanas, nor an underlying mind, an alaya vijnana, as the real substance of conventional things. Yet this unique characteristic of Prāsaṅgika, not appealing to a transcendent principle, without careful framing, can tend towards moral nihilism. This is where Shantideva's Bodhicharya Avatara, read alongside Chandakirti's Vidyamaka, can serve as a corrective to nihilistic interpretations of Vidyamaka. This paper will show how Shantideva can be read fruitfully with Chandakirti to provide a robust account of Buddhist ethics without appealing to any transcendent principle. It will also consider the place of Buddhist transcendence in the Nyingma Tantric tradition and discuss how Prāsaṅgika Vidyamaka is positioned in relation to the Great Perfection. So the paper is laid out in 3 parts. So the first part, the middle way of Chandakirti. In Vidyamaka in general, there are 2 truths, the ultimate truth of emptiness and the conventional truth. There are many different interpretations of Vidyamaka, but the ultimate truth is always understood as emptiness. So it may seem that it doesn't matter how much, or it doesn't matter much, it might seem, how the conventional truth is understood. That is, sometimes the ultimate truth of emptiness is contrasted with the conventional truth that is understood as atomistic, in accord with the Vaibhashikas, such that the world of appearance is held to be best captured in a description of fundamental particles and moments of consciousness, the building blocks of experience. Other interpretations of Vidyamaka might follow a Sautrantika epistemology when describing the conventional world of appearances and give a pragmatic criterion of truth. In such cases, in contrast to the ultimate truth of emptiness, what counts as conventional reality is efficacious, which is understood to be ineffable particulars rather than the extended objects that are distributed in time and space. Another way that the appearing world of conventional truth might be described in Vidyamaka is as mind only, since the world is shaped by the mind and its habitual tendencies. While the nature of mind is held to be ultimately empty, the appearing world might be said to be reducible to mind, according to this kind of interpretation. In contrast, in what is a uniquely Prāsaṅgika Vidyamaka interpretation, nothing is offered to ground phenomena, even conventionally. Neither particles, nor particulars, nor the mind grounds the world. Nothing does. In fact, to presume that there is a ground is to fail to understand the ultimate truth of emptiness. This is because without realizing that there is nothing to ground phenomena conventionally, one has failed to realize the ultimate truth of emptiness as well. This is why, even while the ultimate truth may be explicitly agreed upon as emptiness, it matters how the conventional truth is understood. This is because how the conventional is understood is as important as how the ultimate truth is understood. And this is particularly important for traditions that describe the unity of the two truths. Since according to Tsongkhapa's Prāsaṅgika, the two truths amount to the same thing, and for Mipam too, there are unity. Even while one may explicitly claim that the ultimate truth is emptiness and that the conventional world is reducible to mind only, to atomism, or to anything else, in fact, in doing this reduction, one is implicitly committed to the metaphysical presuppositions of those grounds, as well as the idea that the appearing world needs a ground or a substance, without which it cannot function. This, however, is none other than a remnant of realism, and thus is part of the problem that holds samsara and suffering in place. The reason why one cannot maintain that ultimately things are empty, while conventionally they are grounded in some other, more fundamental substance, like particles or mind, is because the two truths are not really different. The lack of any ground, substance, or essence in anything is the emptiness of that thing. There is no need for a separate substance that serves as a ground that is more real than anything else. Without a hierarchy of one thing being more real than any other, even conventionally, there is only empty appearances or appearing emptiness, without the slightest separation. When this is not understood, emptiness has not been understood. It is for this reason that in a Madhyamaka interpretation following Tsongkhapa, there is no liberation outside of a Prāsaṅgika understanding of emptiness, because liberation takes place only through a correct view of reality. But this is not limited to solely a Gelugpa interpretation, for in the Nyingma tradition as well, Mipam claimed that one must perfect the view of Prāsaṅgika to conclusively settle upon primordial purity, which is an important feature of this tradition's great perfection view. While a quasi-metaphysical ground of conventional truth may be the extreme of realism, a subtle object of negation that is uniquely overcome in Prāsaṅgika, the other extreme is that of nihilism. A nihilistic view can take shape when the conventional truth is simply rendered in terms of consensus, or what is renowned in the world, without a means to make meaningful distinctions. Denying an independent ground for truth, even conventionally, may be thought to entail just this kind of pernicious relativism with no criteria whatsoever for determining what is right and wrong, for what is true or false. Without any bedrock foundation to ground the conventional truth other than the conventions themselves, it might be tempting to lean on simply consensus to describe the world. But consensus on its own simply supports the status quo. Such an unreflective, conservative stance cannot be the final arbiter of Buddhist truth. Thus, in order to avoid what Tom Tillemans dubbed the dismal slough of conservative consensus and pernicious relativism, there must be a means to reform the conventional truth, without which it would be impossible to get any change off the ground, whether it is a scientific revolution, a social revolution, or a revolution on the scale of a liberating personal transformation. This is where Shantideva steps in, to provide Prāsaṅgika with an ethical framework based solely in convention, without a transcendent metaphysical foundation. So part 2. In Tibet, Shantideva is paired with Chandrakirti as a Prāsaṅgika Madhyamaka. In a significant way, this pairing provides a means to build an ethics into Chandrakirti's radical philosophy without metaphysical foundations, even conventionally. Shantideva grounds ethics in a naturalistic world without appealing to what is transcendent. That is, he builds a Mahayana ethics out from the fact that no one wants to suffer and everyone wants to be happy. Of course, we all may have different ideas of what constitutes happiness and ways we think we can achieve it. But sometimes, or rather most of the time, those means and goals are misguided. A child may think happiness lies in cotton candy. A teenager may think happiness equals popularity. An older person may seek happiness in wealth, a partner, and so on. But each of these things is insufficient for a Buddhist. They are impermanent and tied into structures that perpetuate suffering. The only true happiness for a Buddhist is liberation, and for the Mahayana Buddhist, true happiness is not just liberation that is individualized and personal, but one that is universal in scope and inclusive of all beings. The wish to achieve this kind of complete liberation for all beings is bodhicitta, the spirit of awakening. And Shantideva develops an ethic of bodhicitta grounded on equalizing oneself and others. By drawing upon the fact that just as I want to be happy and to avoid suffering, so does everyone else, he builds an altruistic ethics. He deconstructs the assumption of an independent, bounded self to show the irrationality of a self-centered perspective, exposing the fact that there is no reasonable justification for self-centeredness. By appealing to the universality of the pursuit of happiness, Shantideva shifts the burden to the one who justifies egocentric behavior. He does not just offer a probative argument or an abstract logical proof to make his case for altruism, but grounds his logic in human experience to reveal that there is no logic that supports the egoist, independent pursuit. Shantideva's ethics extend the range of concern beyond the individual to everyone based on the natural fact that no one wants to suffer and that everyone wants to be happy. Given this immanent truth, it is arbitrary to privilege any one person's particular interests. The arguments he puts forward, which consistently take the form of reductios, deconstruct the logic of egoism and presume, or the logic of egoism that presume the reality of a discrete individual or an enduring self that could serve to justify egocentrism. Shantideva's approach is rooted in the logic of interconnectivity at the heart of existence, and he draws upon the logic to undermine the presumption of any transcendent principle, like a singular, independent, and permanent self. Shantideva's process of equalizing self and other comes to be described as a means to cultivate relative bodhicitta, in contrast to ultimate bodhicitta. Ultimate bodhicitta is knowing the nature of things, while relative bodhicitta is the means by which this comes to be known. This twofold distinction represents two approaches to Buddhist truth and another iteration of the middle way. From the top down, starting from the ultimate, as we see in the Great Perfection, and from the bottom up, as articulated in the first 8 chapters of Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara. Ultimate bodhicitta is the realization of the unconditioned nature of reality. Meditative practices that disclose a pure nature at the ground of being, unveiled after the obscurations that cloud it are removed, can be said to directly engage a top-down approach based on the view that the qualities of awakening are already here, yet lie beyond an ordinary being's benighted comprehension. A bottom-up approach, in contrast, involves directed training and discipline, like we see in Shantideva's arguments and contemplative practices of mind training. Unlike a top-down approach, this is not about going with the flow or simply letting the innate qualities of mind express themselves. Rather, the bottom-up approach is better described as breaking the cycle of suffering. This technique involves restraint and discipline to train the mind by turning it away from habitual, destructive patterns to shape it into skillful responses and expressions. Significantly, the contrast between the bottom-up methods of mind training and conventional logic drawn from Shantideva's Madhyamaka and the top-down logic of the non-conceptual, the unbounded wholeness of the Great Perfection, comes into clear focus in an institutional transformation that took place with the rise of monastic education in the Nyingma tradition, which was historically a yogic and tantric tradition. And we heard about this transformation in Nate's paper. The different ways these traditions negotiated the boundaries of this contrast shaped the configuration of their institutions, as we see in alternative Nyingma interpretations of Prāsaṅgika and responses to issues such as whether or not logic and Prāsaṅgika have a place at all in the Nyingma tradition, which was traditionally defined by Tantra, whether or not Prāsaṅgika is to be relegated to exclusively an exoteric or non-tantric domain for the Nyingma, and whether or not Prāsaṅgika indeed is an essential component of a tantric view. In contrast to an ethics built solely upon the empty foundations of interdependence, as the conventional reality of suffering and the pursuit of happiness shared by all beings, the great perfection grounds the world in the nature of Buddhahood, in a positive ground of being. Can this kind of appeal be compatible with Prāsaṅgika Vidyamaka's radical denials? This is a question that faces the Nyingma tradition and comes into a sharp focus in the 19th century when we see that traditions either maintained a clear boundary between the exoteric system of Vidyamaka and the esoteric system of Tantra, or they brought them together in a creative synthesis. In the Great Perfection, ultimate bodhicitta is cultivated by an appeal to the natural state, the nature of mind. The nature of mind is nothing other than the natural Buddha. Allowing this nature to express itself, unfiltered and uninflected by bad habits of self-centeredness and the desires and aggressions that this selfishness spawns, is a way to allow the natural qualities of compassion and wisdom to shine forth. These innate qualities of mind shine when we get out of the way, so to speak, and remove the defilements and hindrances that obscure the light of wisdom and love in the way that the sun comes out when the clouds disperse. With this kind of appeal to a natural Buddha, there's a shift, a tantric distinction, that undermines not only a temporal path to achieve a future goal, but also the place and justification of ethics. While Shantideva articulates the conventional dimension of bodhicitta as a dependently arisen development, a conditioned product of rewiring the mind to be more compassionate from the bottom up, the ultimate compassionate resonance of emptiness and luminosity in the great perfection is unconditioned, a top-down model that turns the process of transformation on its head, such that there is no thing to add or to remove with the natural Buddha. The primordiality or timelessness of the Buddha's unconditioned wisdom or ultimate bodhicitta reconfigures the role of temporality in a Buddhist interpretation. Since awakening is the nature of being, suffering and even the path to end it are fundamentally illusions. So, rather than grounding ethics solely in a contingent, immanent world, tantric traditions like the Great Perfection derive ethics from a transcendent source, or otherwise can be said to be trans-ethical, which puts them in tension with the naturalistic framework of emptiness and interdependence that is the metaphysical basis of ethics in a uniquely Prāsaṅgika Madhyamaka framework. In conclusion, it is in the immanence of conventional truth, in the collapse of ultimate foundations, where Shantideva recovers ethics in Charnakirti's radical emptiness. Building upon the innate wish to be happy, he shapes an altruistic ethics without an appeal to transcendence. In doing so, virtue is not tethered to a transcendent world, but is anchored to dependent arising and delusion, the matrix of suffering and the fundamental wish to be free of it. According to Shantideva, the world is grounded in illusion, and even the Buddhas are like illusions. While this interpretation may be shared to an extent in the Great Perfection, there's a shift in what grounds ethical norms. This is a shift from the impure to the pure, from a matrix of mundane pain and delusion to one based on transcendent wisdom and love, in the tripartite ground of the Great Perfection, empty essence, luminous clarity, and compassionate resonance, which is what enables compassionate activity. This appeal to transcendence ties ethics into a positive foundation that not only supplants a naturalistic ethics, but arguably transcends it. This feature contrasts starkly with Prāsaṅgika Vidyamaka, at least an interpretation of Prāsaṅgika Vidyamaka that, like Tsongkhapa's, is framed as a unique and complete metaphysical system. Namely, it is one that is not reliant on non-Prāsaṅgika descriptions of conventional truth. The reason for this is that emptiness and interdependence alone serve as the basis for this kind of uniquely Prāsaṅgika ethics, precisely because there is no transcendent principle or ground. Yet the role of ethics in tantric traditions like the Great Perfection, in contrast, are characterized by explicit appeals to a transcendent source beyond good and evil. And along with this appeal, ethics tends to be instrumentalized in service of this transcendence, since ethics itself, being tied to duality, is ultimately to be transcended. The contrast between these two approaches is not missed by traditions that draw a clear line between Madhyamaka as an exoteric philosophy and Tantra as an esoteric practice. In fact, several Nyingma monastic traditions, including scholars at Katok Monastery, for instance, depict the great perfection as aligned with other emptiness, Shindong, and thus beyond the purview of Prāsaṅgika. Other Nyingma institutions, in contrast, situated an interpretation of Prāsaṅgika following Tsongkhapa within the context of exoteric study, while maintaining a distinctively Nyingma tantric curriculum. The Nyingma monastic traditions associated with Dzogchen Monastery, however, rendered a creative synthesis of the great perfection with Prāsaṅgika Madhyamaka by representing Prāsaṅgika not as a complete ethical and metaphysical system, as Tsongkhapa did, but as an essential yet necessarily incomplete aspect of truth. This interpretation aligns Prāsaṅgika with a feature shared with Tantra, namely performativity, rather than simply systematicity, which is a characteristic feature of institutionalized philosophy. In notable contrast to Tsongkhapa's depiction of Prāsaṅgika as a totalizing system, the features of performativity and incompleteness in the Dzogchen synthesis allows Prāsaṅgika to play a central role in Buddhist theory, while also enabling its constitutive dependence on non-Prāsaṅgika systems to render fundamental elements of a Buddhist worldview, including its metaphysics and ethics. That is, Prāsaṅgika here is situated within the unity of the great perfection view to convey solely the empty aspect of primordial purity, which is supplemented by the appearing aspect of spontaneous presence from which it is inseparable. This interpretation preserves the indispensable place of a Prāsaṅgika view, yet subsumes it within the theory and practice of the great perfection. At the same time, this interpretation moves the metaphysical basis of ethics away from the immanent world to a transcendent truth, and thereby shifts the justification of ethics from the natural expression of no self in a uniquely Prāsaṅgika interpretation to the divine expression of a unified ground of being. The justification of ethics in the great perfection thus stems not only from within the illusory nature of empty appearances in an immanent world, but also from the divine nature of transcendent wisdom. The institutions of exoteric monastic education are in tension with the margins of tantric and yogic practice, where the great perfection has its roots. The institutionalization of the historically yogic and tantric Nyingma tradition, beginning in the 18th century and culminating in the founding of the Sri Simha Monastic College at Dzogchen Monastery in the 19th, is based on a formula that integrates the top-down ethos of the great perfection and the bottom-up logos of the Madhyamaka, and reimagines the synthesis that Tsongkhapa initiated with his wedding of Chandrakirti and Shantideva as a metaphysical basis of ethics within emptiness, to a tradition that weds emptiness to the plenitude of divinity. This is one way that the bottom-up tradition of Prāsaṅgika Madhyamaka and a top-down tantric tradition like the Great Perfection can be seen to meet in the middle. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions or comments if anyone has any.
Thank you so much, Douglas. This wonderful talk. I have just simple question. if I heard you correctly, you seems saying that Chandakirti and the Shantideva's agenda would be different. One is more focused on ethics, one is more focused on the Madhyamika view. I understand traditionally treated in that way, but if we look at Madhyamika Avatara, it's based on 10 perfections or 6 paramitas. It begins with this compassion and sort of non-do, but also bodhicitta, and then goes with generosity and so forth. So it's not really just, seems to me, ethics is only based on Shantideva, but maybe Shantideva is influenced by, could be Chandakirti. So can you clarify a little bit more on that?
Okay, thank you. So I believe it was Tsongkhapa that was the first to put Shantideva and Chandakirti together as Prāsaṅgika Vidyamakas. I could be wrong. Please correct me, anyone, after if I'm wrong, now or later. So certainly Chandakirti, there is place for ethics in Chandakirti, but it's just made explicit in Shantideva. So I think Shantideva read with Chandakirti kind of gives, supplements Chandakirti in a way that grounds ethics in interdependence in the world without needing to appeal to any foundation. And so I don't want to follow Tom Tillemans and saying that Chandakirti is a dismal slough. I just want to say that Shantideva explicates Chandakirti, because he certainly spends a lot more time on chapter 6, but there is, he does make this praise to compassion and bodhicitta in the beginning, but he spends a lot of time in chapter 6. But I think that pairing is an important and interesting pairing.
Thank you, Douglas. That was really great, and the performativity aspect seems really interesting and insightful. My question is, for this tradition of Nyingma that marries Prāsaṅgika and Dzogchen and kind of shows that they can be married, do you think for them that they need to be? That is Prāsaṅgika necessary for Dzogchen, or just if one's so inclined, one can approach Dzogchen from within a Prāsaṅgika perspective?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I guess it depends on who's Dzogchen, and because I cited Mipam, who says that, in order to come to terms with primordial purity, you have to you have to perfect the Prāsaṅgika view. So for him, I think it's an important. There is an important view distinction, I think, and Tsongkhapa makes this important view distinction such that there's no liberation anywhere else. And as we saw, like Alex's talk, like there's a lot of Dzogchenpas that will say, no, it's Shendong, Dzogchen, and I mentioned, I didn't mention his name, but Getse Penchen also says that, it's Dzogchen is in accord with Shendong and other emptiness. So, but I think there's an interesting moment, and maybe it is tied to the performativity, because it's not a totalizing system. I think that's in writing this paper, I came to see where with this Gaemong movement that we've talked about, as a distinction from the Rime movement, that is really more like Prāsaṅgika friendly and Gelug friendly, and the Bodhicharya Vatara is very important for this tradition. Patrul Rinpoche and Shabkar and Mipam and Khenpo Shinga and so on. I think that this formula allowed or contributed to the success of Sri Simha, which was the model for not only Nyingma traditions, but the Palpung and arguably Dzonsar, Sakya, and Kagyu traditions as well. So I think it is significant that this unity of appearance and emptiness that gives a real place for ethics. It's not instrumentalized, and also it cuts through duality, both subject-object duality, but also temporal duality between like this kind of, what Wendell-Berry has described as the cult of the future, like kind of a postponement of, or Nietzschean nihilism, that there's some future kind of resolution. But with Prāsaṅgika, there's a direct, kind of instantaneous kind of avenue or performance of this, as you mentioned, this cutting through conceptual constructs, as opposed to doing it in a gradual way. So I think it does have an important place, at least that moment, since it's incomplete in contrast to Tsongkhapa, but Tsongkhapa wants to have a totalizing system that you do everything. You don't need non-Prāsaṅgika, and you don't want non-Prāsaṅgika because that'll reify the conventional truth. But I do think it's important for the Dzogchen monastic college institutionalization of Dzogchen, and has become a recipe that has been very influential.
Well, thank you so much.